Hello, everyone. This video is a part of series Understanding Auteur Films, based on 3-volume books of the same title. In this video we will talk about Hollywood films of the 1940s. Hollywood films of the 1940s. When it comes to Hollywood films of the 1940s, most people who think of classic films of old days or masterpieces of film history are probably over 50, or more likely over 60. I'm over 50 myself, but I have no particular attachment to Hollywood films of that era. Even if they are told that a typical Hollywood film of the 1940s to be a masterpiece of old days, that probably only makes sense to people of my parents' generation who lived in cities back then. To be honest, I think that many of Hollywood's masterpieces of that time are hopelessly outdated. Regardless of the credibility of the stories, their images does not seem real at all. I felt this already in the late 1980s, when I began to study cinema professionally. But then, during the bubble era, there was an atmosphere of nostalgia and authoritarianism, and whether it was Hollywood or Japanese films, they said, old films are good, just watch them again and learn from them. Middle-aged and elderly intellectuals at that time exerted silent pressure on the youth. However, over time, as if to keep pace with Japan's economic decline, people began to say that the era of the liberal arts was over, and even an extreme illusion began to spread that the latest otaku culture is all we need. In the end, it was difficult for us film scholars to calmly examine the essence of works of cinematic art, and even if we could do that, there would be no place to publish it. The lack, or unjustified neglect, of substantial research into films based on the artistic achievements of contemporary authors has also affected the quality of Japanese cinema. That is the reality. I think even movie lovers of the Zero generation will understand it. If I simply say, watch them and you will understand it intuitively, it will be unconvincing, like authoritarian criticism based on impressions, and ultimately it will be each person in his own way. Below, from my point of view as a theorist, I will start with what is intuitively, you can see it when you watch them, and then I will explain a few points with examples and, finally, we'll come to a logical conclusion. Expressive and contrived images. For now, let's start from an intuitive level. Just pick 1 or 2 Hollywood films of the 1940s and watch them a little at a time. If you are busy, please watch for less than 10 minutes. After that, watch at least a few serious films after the 70s, for example, The Godfather, The Verdict, Schindler's List, or even non-Hollywood auteur films. This is also enough for about 10 minutes each. Doesn't the image, which includes sound for today's general audience, not only seem not real, but too contrived to be ignored? The same is true whether it's a B-movie or a masterpiece by Orson Welles or Frank Capra. If contrived is too strong a word, old goes too. Otherwise, restored versions of Casablanca, 42, Citizen Kane, 41, and Meet John Doe, 41, would still be shown every day in major theaters. Actually, it's not so. They're too old and there's not enough market demand for them to be a big hit. So why do we perceive Hollywood films of the time as contrived and outdated while watching them? Look at the images of Welles's Citizen Kane and Capra's Meet John Doe. They are truly expressive images. The lighting, composition and editing style are in harmony with the actors' performances, making them incomparable to recent flat television series. However, being expressive and being real are utterly different things. The images of Welles and Capra are certainly rich in expressive power, and you can feel the genius and skill of the filmmakers in them. It appears to be an exhibition of impressive film techniques. The first uses deep focus cinematography, in which the set is shown with strong light so that everything from the foreground to the background of shots is in focus, and the second uses fast and skillful editing. However, this is precisely why it now seems contrived or artificial. Regardless of the content of the story or the acting, the masterpieces of that time overly mono-pirated image and sound, although the sound was monophonic. Moreover, the authors seemed to be convinced that it was necessary in order for a realistic story to appear individual. It's a waste considering they're dealing with such universal themes. Today, there is a calmer way to treat with such universal themes while maintaining the authenticity of the images. For example, if you watch Paul Thomas Anderson's There Will Be Blood, 2007, you'll understand. What about images of Hollywood B-movies of the time? Due to the small budget, much of the filming was done on location, and a good crime film is said to reflect the harsh reality of the big city in its images. The backstory of the incident is explained using a large amount of anonymous narrator and newsreel-like subtitles, or by the main character's hard-boiled style narration, also in voiceover, and the plot unfolds in a short period of time, without the need for fast-forward viewing. These B-movies tend to ruin the realism of the images with expository narration and fast-paced action. The participation of a qualified storyteller and an effective exchange of spoken words, allowing one to avoid wasting even a foot of film, turns out to be fatal. Beware of talkative masterpieces. From the 1940s to 50s, there was a trend in feature films to use narration, formerly called voice-over narration. For feature films, voice-over narration is a technique that requires more care than subtitling. No matter how realistic the images are, the moment the audience hears the narration, they are detached from the story world of the film and begin to realize the artificiality of the story being narrated. If you just want to tell a story through images, you don't need a narrator like you would in a novel. In fact, most feature films don't have a narrator. And in contemporary cinema, even if the characters do not actually tell the story, they can make us feel that the content of the story belongs to the inner lives of the characters. However, such clever editing techniques were not present in Hollywood films of the 1940s. This is because the characters were telling a story. If one wanted to show that all or part of a story is the memory or imagination of a character, usually the main character, the most orthodox and easiest way for audiences to understand at the time was the following. The face of the person remembering or imagining is shown in close-up, and at the same time, as the images fade into images of the past or imagination, the person's voice is heard. Today this technique seems old-fashioned. Lately, many simplified types have appeared that connect images of the past or imagination directly or without narration. Also, as a variation of this type, when a character looks out a window or at distant mountains, the camera tracks or pans there, pushing the real character out of the frame and goes into the long shot of the main character inside a memory or imagination, etc. In this case, the character's voice does not necessarily have to be narration, but rather, for example, it is enough for the character to talk to someone and their voices become an off-screen, then gradually fade. The transition to memories and imaginations of a simplified or modified type, without character narration, began to be observed only from the mid-1960s to the 1970s. If you are interested, see films such as Zabriskie Point and Passenger by Michelangelo Antonioni, Andrei Rublev, Solaris, and Mirror by Andrei Tarkovsky. Films of the late 1940s also frequently used narrators, similar to that used in news reporting. However, if creators are trying to convey realism, introducing a news report-type narrator can have the opposite effect. A good example of this is Jules Dassin's The Naked City, 48, which, like neorealism, features actors acting in a real New York setting, but includes voice-over narration that destroys the realism of the image from the very beginning. The following narration from a male voice is added on an aerial view of New York City. Ladies and gentlemen, the picture you are about to see is called The Naked City. My name is Mark Hallinger. I was in charge of its production. I might as well tell you frankly that it's a bit different from most films that you've ever seen. As you see, we are flying over an island, a city, a particular city. And this is a story of a number of people, and it is the story of the city itself. It was not photographed in a studio, quite contrary. In this way the film cannot compare with the realism of Bicycle Thieves, 48. Moreover, this talkative narrator continues to act as an omniscient narrator from time to time. An omniscient narrator in a feature film doesn't necessarily ruin the reality of the film, but it probably wouldn't work with the reporter style in a feature film or TV series. The dry, confident, leading voice of a middle-aged man makes the film seem flatter than it actually is, making the story look like a tabloid newspaper article. If such a narrator were included in a war film, it would instantly turn into a propaganda film. This type of voice-over narration was used in low-budget sci-fi fiction films in the 1950s to reduce production costs, and ultimately led to the creation of The Beast of Yucca Flats, 61, considered one of the worst live-action films. It's not worth watching. Using an omniscient narrator would produce better results if the narration were lyrical and restrained, conveying only a minimum of information. This means that it does not interfere with viewing, and sometimes even gives the impression of hope or sublimity to a sad story. However, this only happens with the help of the gentle, sweet, almost featureless background music that was common in Hollywood films of the 40s. If the story is not nostalgic or melodramatic, and if the audience will not tolerate a narrator like that of a lyrical novel, it will not be effective. This type of unobtrusive narration can be found in Random Harvest, 42, or Portrait of Jenny, 48, etc. However, now even films and TV series of these genres usually do not feature omniscient narrators. This was already the case in the early 1980s. Because music and images alone are enough to convey what is needed. Since the 1960s, voiceover narration, in which characters, especially the main character, tell the entire story of the film, and narration by an omniscient narrator have completely fallen out of fashion in feature films. Successful examples include Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, 71, and Barry Lyndon, 75. In other words, unless you have Kubrick's level of talent, introducing such a narrator is risky. The evolution of the standard style of feature films has made masterpieces obsolete. People who usually enjoy movies as entertainment may not realize, but despite the wide variety of plots and themes, Hollywood films of the 1940s were bound, from today's viewpoint, to very rigid norms of style. This does not mean that most of the works were shot in black and white, on standard format. The rules of visual storytelling were too strict. If one wanted to express something, for example, several minutes or hours have passed, months or years have passed, the situation around the main character has changed dramatically, or dramatic news has spread across the country, or the world, then it was accepted to apply a certain processing to an image, as if it were a grammar of film. No one decided so, and Hollywood filmmakers of that time followed it voluntarily. This has become part of the standard style of feature film. For example, if the main character, hospitalized in a mental hospital, wanders around the city and comes into contact with people here and there, he can move from the gates of the mental hospital to the factory district of the city, from the shops in there to the crowds of people on the street. In reality, this will take from several minutes to hours. Hollywood films of the 1940s almost always used dissolve to convey such short periods of time. Use wipe if you're to show something in a different space than the main character, or if the main character himself will move to a completely different time and space. As months or years pass, the previous scene ends with a fade out, and the next scene begins with a long shot emerging from the dark, clearly showing the passage of time. Or the same landscape or part of it is shown with changes from winter to spring, from spring to summer, by using dissolve. When the situation around the main character changes dramatically or dramatic news flashes, a technique called montage sequence is used, etc. Do you think this is obvious? No, these techniques are as outdated as if modern novelists write "yes, sir" instead of "yeah." That's why great modern directors use each of them only once or a few times